Okay, good afternoon. My name is Wu Ming Huang, and this is the full, and I am a faculty member here in Vietnam Studies and History, and I'm currently the major coordinator for Vietnam Studies at Fulbright University, Vietnam. But in the near future, we are soon to have another one, and you get to know about him today. Is our very own Nicolas Weber, who will be speaking with us today about a Cham Odyssey, 10 centuries of diasporic history. So we're very, very honored to have that. And just a few words about the Fulbright, the World Beyond the Book program. This is a great program that has a lot of support from the undergraduate program. Big thanks for our UG program for funding this, and also big thanks to the IT team and also the communications team, who, even though they're extremely busy, have been supporting us this whole time. So we're very, very grateful. It's a series of 7 talks every semester that bring in top researchers on Vietnam to works, mostly books, but also manuscripts incoming, like this one, are also very, very welcome. And this is the 3rd talk of this semester, and we have our very own, we don't, sometimes we bring in amazing people from afar, but sometimes we also have right here at Fulbright a great Vietnam studies program, and we have our very own Nicolas Weber. He specializes in Southeast Asian history, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Malaysia, ethnohistory, and diasporas. He received his PhD from INALCO, which is the National Institute for Oriental Languages and Civilizations in Paris, France, in 2005. He has worked extensively on ethnic history, Cham history, and the Cham diaspora in Southeast Asia. In his first monograph, which was published in French in 2014, features the first synthesis of 10 centuries of Cham diasporic history in Southeast Asia. He has also published in peer-reviewed academic journals, such as the Journal of Economic and Social History of the Orient, Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, Sojourn, the Journal of the Malaysian branch of the Asiatic Society, as well as the Bulletin de l'École Française d'Extrême Orient, EFEO, Archipel and Peninsula. So he's, he is our senior faculty here. He is really, really well known and well published, and we're very, very lucky to have him join us in this past academic year. He's already started teaching some great courses, and I hope that many more students and faculty will get to know of his work and join his courses in the next year. Starting, actually, your next opportunity will be in the summer for Vietnam Studies and History students. You'll be able to do an independent research seminar with Professor Weber, which is in collaboration with Princeton University. And the outcome is that your work will be presented at an international conference hosted by Princeton, but there are also going to be many other institutions participating from Europe, from Middle East, from South America, and so on. So it's a great opportunity if you guys are around in the summer, if you want to do some research, get 4 credits of experiential learning, and also experience in international conference presentation. This is a golden opportunity. We run it every year, and Nicolas has graciously agreed to take it up this year. Now, his on the research side, his research involves extensive analysis of sources in vernacular languages, and particularly in Cham and Vietnamese. Through his research, publication, and talks, he has sought to give importance to underrepresented groups' perspectives, which is also something that we really want to do with the Vietnam Studies program here. I think for a long time, Vietnam Studies has been very much from the King perspective and hasn't paid enough attention to non-king perspectives, and that's increasingly going to be something that we're going to change with this program. He believes that in a multifaceted history, such as that Vietnam, it's important to demonstrate different narratives that exist within various ethnic groups. In addition, it creates the opportunity to give voice to people who have been involved in crucial historical events. Now, about this talk, it's going to be based on a book manuscript that Professor Weber has more or less been writing over the past decade. So it's very, very much soon to be published. He offers the first comprehensive study of the history of the Cham diaspora in mainland Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, and also aims to show the patterns of the historical development of the Cham diaspora and documents their participation into the development of the region, drawing on a large corpus of sources in the Cham, Vietnamese, Khmer, Malay, and French languages. The book covers a broad chronology from the 10th to the 20th centuries and geographical scope to reflect the diversity and similarity, as well as the specificity and continuity of the various stages of development of the Cham diaspora. While sharing his own journey through research, Nicolas will also reflect on the nature and meaning of the sources he has used, which, while expressing Cham uniqueness and singular history, are also strangely relatable and universal. So I'd encourage you guys to please grab some food if you're here. If you're online, wherever you are, grab some tea, grab some food, sit back, and enjoy the show. Take it away, Nicolas.
All right. Thank you very much, Wang, for this introduction, and thank you to all for coming. Thank you to my colleagues. Thank you to Mira for coming. I know that everybody is quite busy right now, but thank you. I really appreciate that. So, well, I don't want this to be a lecture on the history of the Cham diaspora in Southeast Asia, right? That's not exactly my point today. I just wanted to share my own journey through research and also my thoughts regarding the materials that I've used. Like Tai Huang's mentioned, I've been working on this topic for quite a number of years right now. I think it's actually more than 10, it's 20. I started working on this for my PhD, actually. So I promise this is only family pictures that I have, but the topic was strongly suggested by Podama, who was my kind of advisor and who was also my mentor. He was like kind of spiritual father. He passed away a few years back, but he was like, yeah, why don't you do something on Cham diaspora in Southeast Asia? So I was like, okay, why not? So that's how I started to be interested in this topic. And I guess I was interested because I was already working on Cham history, modern Cham history, and particularly in Vietnam, but also because in a way it resonated with my own family history. Well, I'm not from a Cham background at all. I'm not from Vietnam, not from Southeast Asia, but part of my family from my father's side is from Morocco. And they left when Morocco achieved independence in 1958. And my grandmother, my father's mom, she never quite recovered from it. So there is this very strong sense of exile that she transmitted me, which was very strong throughout my childhood. The way she was talking about Morocco was like, okay, that was her country. So I guess that really also gave me like some emotional foundation to my own research. So I published a first version of my findings in French in 2014. This book is actually drawn from my PhD dissertation, and it's very, very history and politics oriented. However, I don't want to offer like a simple translation of it in English. I'm revising a lot of things, and I'm trying to reflect on the sources that I'm using, something that I haven't done at all when I published this book, and try to understand like the emotional underpinnings of Cham sources in particular. So first of all, why the title? I think it might sound surprising, maybe to Mira, to see that that word Odyssey is quite strange, right? Actually, I chose it because I wanted to, first of all, I wanted to take out from the title the term exile or diaspora, because I mean, I'm using these terms throughout the manuscript, so I thought, okay, maybe for the title I could use something else. But it was a way to pay homage to one of the first Vietnamese writer, the first scholar, who has written an article about the Cham diaspora in Vietnam in the 60s. Yeah. Oh yeah, I forgot to put the 1963. So he's the very first that has dedicated a full journal article, which was published for the masses and not only intellectuals. It was published in this journal, Bakwa, which to me is like it's not a scientific journal, but it opens social sciences and history to the general public. I don't know if Wang, you agree with me? So that was a journal that was very popular during the 60s and the 70s in Vietnam. So he is also the first that has spent time to look at the history of this diaspora. Nobody has done it before. Some French during the colonial period had worked on the Cham, of course, but it was only through mainly a religious perspective or ethnic perspective. So nobody really questioned their particular history. So my title is a way to pay homage to his work. So yeah. So basically, most of my work is based on the analysis and the interpretation of documents in vernacular languages such as Vietnamese, Khmer, Thai, French, and Malay. I don't read Khmer and Thai, unfortunately, but I used translations of the historical materials. They are quite easily available. But I've used mainly Cham sources, which are understudied, and as well as Vietnamese official sources. So I always compared my sources, right? When I see something in the Cham sources, I always try to find not a confirmation, but yeah, kind of comparison, confirmation in Vietnamese sources. So I put here the list of the few documents, not the few documents, but some of the documents that I've used. And here there are some examples of the text. So for the Vietnamese official sources, I've used mainly the translated versions in Khmer, right? Because it's easier to access. When I could, I would have a look at the text in Chinese, but I use mainly the modern Vietnamese version. That's a text from the Cham in Cambodia. That's the way they write. And that's a narrative, by the way. And this is something in Khmer. Yeah. So I thought it would be interesting to share a little bit of my inspiration, and especially to our students, right, who some of you are going through a research project, right? When I first started to work on this topic, I've been very influenced by two books. These two books actually changed my way of looking at history, and also oriented my own work. The first one, which was extremely important for me in my, I would say, my life, it's Eichmann in Jerusalem from Hannah Arendt, and especially her her theories regarding the behavior of the Jewish leaders during the Holocaust period, right? Their cooperation with the Nazi regime and all these things. So I was reading that, maybe I was in my 20s. That was a shock to me. It was a real shock. And I tried to question the knowledge that I've been receiving from my mentor, right, regarding the Cham communities. He was an activist. He was Cham himself. He was from central Vietnam, Binh Thuan and Ninh Thuan. Well, he was from Ninh Thuan. And the way he featured the history of the Cham, right, was always from a victim standpoint. There were the victim of the Vietnamese, of course. There were victims of history, victims of the French, victims of everybody. Of course, I was young. I first received it, and that's how I started to look at the history from a victim point of view. But when I read this book, that actually changed things. It's like, okay, reading that, I realized that the choices of a minority group are never easy, right? And it's not black and white. It cannot be like that. And when I went further into the study of Cham sources, I found out that, yeah, some Cham elites have collaborated with colonial regimes, such as Vietnam, of course, but also the French and also the Khmer, and they had very different political agendas and all. So there's no victims and what do you call? Yeah, perpetrator, sorry, thanks. But yeah, it's far more complex than that. And the second book that that really had a very profound influence on my work, and this is more related to my topic, right, was the book by Ben Kiernan, who's from Yale University, a very, very famous specialist of the Cambodian genocide. And particularly his book on the Pol Pot regime, who gives a very large importance on the genocide of the Cham in Cambodia from 1979. And this made me realize the importance of the network, the Cham networks in Cambodia, and the importance of the political importance of the community, something that somehow wasn't featured at all in all the studies that I've looked at so far. So these are two the main sources of inspiration, I would say. So just rapidly, I just wanna present the themes that I'm going through in this book. I first start with the first historical exile of the Cham to South China, Hainan Island and North Vietnam. There was actually quite a big Cham community that was established by the Vietnamese themselves in North Vietnam. Of course, nowadays totally invisible. Of course, that's the biggest part of my work. I feature the history of the Cham exiles to Cambodia. I try to draw a chronology of that. I also dedicated a chapter on why the Cham left, and I'm explaining the background, what was happening back in Vietnam, why they left, and I'm introducing some Cham material about their perspective, what was going on at that time. Then I analyzed the Cham political involvement and the role of the Cham networks and factions, and especially in 18th century and 19th century Cambodia. I'm looking at Cham relations with the colonizing powers, such as Vietnam in the 19th century and French in the second half of the 19th century. I also look at the foundation of Cham settlements in southwestern Vietnam, in Tay Ninh and Chau Doc more particularly. And then I finish with Cham communities in Siam and Cham diaspora in Malaysia, which is what I called in the book in French, I call it a diaspora within a diaspora. It's actually, they are not coming from Vietnam, they are coming from Cambodia. So they're already members of the diaspora, but they've been either displaced or they fled to either Thailand, Siam, or Malaysia. So that's basically what I intend to do. For the English version, I want to include as much as Cham material as possible, because yeah, these sources are not available. There are no translations. Yeah, the issue that I'm facing right now is, and I will come back to that in a moment, but most of the Cham sources are in verse. And so I'm having a tough time into turning that into verse. I'm not a poet myself, so I would like to do it because that would be more truthful to the source, but well, yeah, I'm trying to. Right, so that's a copy, the first page of one of the narratives I've used. This one deals with a displacement of Cham from Phnom Penh to southwestern Vietnam in 1843, 1844. It was about 2,000 Cham who were displaced by the Vietnamese to be settled permanently in southwestern Vietnam. So it describes very movingly the displacement of these people, what happened. Okay, yeah. So yeah, I put that on a map. So they were here in Phnom Penh, right? And they were displaced here, Chau Phu, yeah. The descendants of these people are still there. Right? So like I said, right now I'm looking back at the sources I've been using, especially the Cham historical sources. Like I mentioned, most of the sources I've used are written in verse. So all the historical accounts are in verse. And they were not meant to be read silently, they were not meant to be printed, but then they were meant to be chanted in front of an audience or sung in front of an audience, which is, of course, not unique to the Cham at all. It also exists in other Southeast Asian cultures as well. So that is something that there is this relation to history that is very particular, right? It's like not something that is meant to be read or kept by the elites, but it's something that is meant to be transmitted. And the experience of either, I don't know, war, exile and all have to be transmitted. In the case of Cham historical narratives, well, I've been working for quite a while on that. First of all, when I first studied them, I was only looking at the historical content, right? So I was looking for facts, I was looking for names, and also that helped me to build up my my argument on Cham history. But later on, I tried to reflect on what's the importance of this text beside being a historical testimony. Why are they so important? Well, they're important because they transmit an experience. And the way they are written is actually to to strengthen the community links and to generate a sense of empathy within the Cham community, which is deeply divided and scattered all over. So these texts, although they are personal, they are written by one person who is talking about experience and the experience of his community, they are also quite universal. The way they are written and sung in a way that other Chams can relate to them, right? And it's particularly telling when we look at this kind of narratives. There are very few personal names, for instance. Most of the time there are titles of the people who were involved, but they are almost secondary. You can take them away. They don't really matter. And also, they use the terms I, kau in Cham, or us, ita, or they, right? And most of the time, those pronouns are avoided. So, okay, that doesn't make it easy when we have to work on it, on this text, right? But I think it's also a way for the audience to identify with what is happening. So regardless of their own experience, they can identify to this history and to the events that are featured. So here I put an excerpt of one of the narratives I've been working on. So that's the one I mentioned previously, the one depicting the displacement of Cham from Phnom Penh to southwestern Vietnam, and it's very moving narrative. In terms of the language, it's not very complicated. Of course, it's complicated to me because I'm not a Cham speaker, right? So there are things that I miss out. But I can say that it's in a language that is accessible to the masses. It's not meant for an elite at all, and it's not meant for entertainment, as other Southeast Asian traditions would be. So I don't know if you want me to read it out. There will probably be no emotion when I read. Oh, no, that will take too long. Yeah, so I'm going to read that in English. So of course, it's not the full text. It's just some part of it. So it starts this way, and many Cham narratives, either from Cambodia or from Vietnam, start this way. In the year of the rabbit, so when the event takes place, the Cham of Cambodia were all resigned. The Cham of Cambodia were resigned to go to the fortress kingdom. Okay, this one I had a bit of trouble to identify that, but I think it refers to southwestern Vietnam. I say, everything was destroyed. We had to leave the village in a single file. We were leaving the village tripping on our own feet. Listen carefully. We all had to leave the village, and we were moving forward in an endless single line on the roads. Some of us were trembling as we were leaving the country. Others were weeping, calling the names of their children and grandchildren. Some fled in disarray to hide. Others had forgotten that their boats were pierced, but still wanted to use them to escape. Others were pulling them out to flee. So that described, I think, quite movingly, even if it doesn't show it in English, the panic that had stricken these people that were on the verge of being displaced, right? They realized that they didn't have a choice, and they were extremely panicked and didn't know what to do. Some of them tried to escape, but actually they realized that they couldn't. So here, I'll explain it a bit.
tê xa ugang cô mẹ anh xa tê là tê hoa như tê âu khăn to bù vang o mơ xa tê là tê hoa năn như anh so ghê.
Okay, so that's probably the way these narratives were performed. I don't know if you're familiar with Cambodia and all, but the way she sings is very Cambodian, right? The rhythm is Cambodian. The voice also, the way she pronounces is extremely Cambodian. So we have no way to find out if it was the way it was performed, like for instance in the 19th century. I think that it was not. Maybe the melody was something similar, but I think in the 19th century it was performed with a very small musical accompaniment, one or two instruments, maybe a fiddle, like it's most often the case in many Southeast Asian countries, or a drum. That's not to please the audience, that's not to make it more enjoyable, but I think that's to help both the one who is reciting these texts, because they're extremely long, right? These narratives are several pages long, so they can last the whole night. So I think that's to help the narrator, but it also helped to, I think the melodies are helping to emphasize on some certain parts of the narrative, for instance, a war or a conversation or things like that. So that's also that's a help to the narrator and the audience as well to follow, because again it lasted for quite a long time. How I'm knowing this, well, it's a hypothesis, right? But I try to compare this tradition that is lost to East Asia, and similar traditions existing in Java, for instance, where there are some historical texts that are called babad in Javanese, which means chronicles, which were meant also to be sung. And there is, at the beginning of the babad, there is the indication of the rhythm and the melody as well. Right? It's the same for one or two Khmer family chronicle that I've studied. It's exactly the same. They specify the name of the melody that the performer has to use to recite the narrative. So I think that it was the same for Cham narratives. Of course, now this tradition is gone, right? Oh, sorry. Yeah. So in my my work to try to find the meaning of this, the deep meaning of this narrative and the emotional foundations of this text, I try to compare with other texts in Southeast Asia, other sung narratives and narrative written in verse in particular. So at first, well, the easiest would be try to compare it with the Truyền Nom, right? The Vietnamese verse narratives, for instance, Kim Vang Kieu or Phan Cheng or Nui Tu Tai or Lu Vang Ting and etc. In a way, they're similar to the Cham narratives, because the prosody, right, is not the same, but it's comparable. The way it rhymes, yeah, is comparable. However, the meaning and the goal of this narrative is totally different. These narratives in verse in the context of Vietnam are for entertainment only. They are for learned, extremely learned people, educated people, right? Because they are written in a very sophisticated language, which is not accessible to the masses, right? The language is beautiful, of course, but very, very sophisticated, and it also uses a lot of symbolism and references that are escaping most of the people, and myself, of course. So that's not the case of the Cham narratives at all. I tried to compare to other traditions in Southeast Asia and in insular Southeast Asia. I found some points of comparison with this sung poetry from West Java here, right? Which is called Tembang Sunda or Canjuran. So I'm going to play it for a little bit. Okay. Sorry.
Cahaya surya sumirat di langit, murub mubiar ngahibaran
Well, this gives me goosebumps every time I listen to it. So this type of sung poetry is quite similar to the Cham narratives in the sense that it's performed like what you heard in most of the time it's performed during the evening, so the narratives last a whole evening. There are also specific modes, musical modes that are used to sing these narratives or these poems. And just like the Cham narratives, right, they emphasize on the sense of community and empathy of the Sundanese people who are living a bit scattered all around Java. However, they are different because, again, just like the Dringnom, for instance, these narratives or song poetry are for entertainment purposes, right? That they are mainly to entertain the people, and not even though sometimes they could convey some part of the history of this region, the purpose is not there, right? It's mainly for entertainment. And just like the Dringnom, and contrary to the Cham text, they are also written in a very sophisticated language, right? Which is also inaccessible to most of the people. So back to the Cham narratives. Here is another example just to show you the way they can be very moving. And my point was to try to explain why they are moving, because if, like I said, I'm not Cham, right? I haven't lived through this period, so that like totally foreign. But when I read it, I felt extremely touched. So why are they so touching for even for somebody that is remote from that context and that background? So this extract, for instance, this narrative features mainly some political upheaval in 1958 Cambodia, and the internal exile of a Cham community from its province in Kampong Cham to Kampong Chnam. So I'm going to read that again. Many fell sick and died. We had to bury them. That means the people who had died, right? Anywhere we could. Those who had remained alive had to carry the corpses and were wailing. Everybody was crying. Many women had lost their husbands. Children were dying. The carts were full of dead bodies. The acha, which is a religious officer, in that case it's an imam, was exhausted, for he had to bury people every day. He had to dig holes everywhere he could, and even in termite mounds. He buried bodies in termite mounds. He dug into them to use them as tombs. So again, it's much more moving in Cham than it is in English. But interestingly enough, the memory of this still survive in some communities in Cambodia. I've talked to one of my good friends who's also a Cham, who's also working on the Cham, but from the anthropology point of view, it's Emiko, who's Wang knows very well. And she told me that the people that she interviewed, and especially from the older generation, they remembered that event, and they were still extremely moved by this. So they have the memory through such narratives of it, and they can still be extremely moved by it, as if they have lived it. Okay. Don't know, what time is it? So we have, okay, so I'll just have 15 more minutes. Then after that, we can have a discussion. So while doing research again on these narratives, because well, I'm quite obsessed at the moment. So I'm trying to find similar things, right? Instead of isolating the Cham case, and of course they are unique, but at the same time, they are not. So the closest form of narrative in verse that I found is called the Shire. It's a Malay rhyme narrative. This form is actually is used in more broad context, in the sense that it can deal with history, precise historical events or political events, such as this one, the eruption of the volcano Krakatau in 1883. Or it can also deal with love story or moral or religious education and so on. So in that sense, it's much more broader than the Cham narratives. But in the way the events are featured, and the way it appeals to the emotions of the listener, because again, that is something that was meant to be sung. It's quite similar to the Cham narratives I've worked with. So yeah, that's an extract of this narrative, which is also extremely long. The translation is not mine, obviously. So I'll let you read it if you want. So again, it's moving and it's relatable. I haven't lived through a disaster, but I was quite touched by this. Okay, and this is an example of how this poetry is
Syair Bidasari Irama Siti Zawiyah, dinyanyikan oleh author Archa Story, Wahida M.
Dengarkan Tuan satu riwayat, raja di desa negeri Kembayat, dikarang fakir dijadikan hikayat, supaya menjadi tamsil ibarat. Ada raja suatu negeri, Sultan Khalifah Akas Bestari. Asalnya baginda raja yang bahari, melimpah ngadil dagang senteri.
So again, we have no idea how it was performed like 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Like I said, 200 years ago there was a musical accompaniment. Now it's lost. Nobody can play this melody. So that's the standard way of chanting poetry. But I think for this long narrative there was something more specific, right? And finally, well, I'm trying to find again connections between the Cham narratives, the Cham experience that I've been studying for so long, and other experiences in Southeast Asia and in Vietnam in particular. I think my supervisor, my mentor, would kill me if he was here for this comparison that I'm about to make. But in some ways, I found, and that's what I'm going to conclude with. I found some very interesting points of comparison between the Cham narratives I've been talking about with some of the Vong Co in southern Vietnam, right? And particularly the ones that are dealing with like some tragedies, right? And this one particularly, this one called Indestructible Heart, and which depicts the self-immolation of the monk. What's his name again? Yeah, Thich Quang Duc. Yeah, Thich Quang Duc in 1963 to protest the Ngo Dinh Diem and anti-Buddhist policies. So he killed himself in Saigon. He set himself on fire, and the way it is written, starting with the dates and then slowly progressing through the event, is extremely similar to the narratives I've studied. So that's something that really struck me, and again, it moved me. I don't pretend that I understood the meanings of the lyrics immediately, right? I had to look online to have the lyrics first, and then I had to a bit work on it. But I could be touched by that exactly in the same way that I was touched by Cham narrative. So there is a very universal emotion and universal message that can be that are shared through these narratives and the Vong Co or the Cham narratives. So here I put an extract of this Vong Co. It's sung by this very
Ngày 20 tháng 4 năm Quý Mão, một cung tinh làm dân chúng thầy thương tâm. Một nhà sư đã tự tiêu thân giữa đại lộ Phan Đình Phùng Lê Văn Duyệt. Qua lớp khói mờ bay trông thấy một nhà sư còn ngồi chắp tay niệm Phật. Mà bao nhiêu người chứng kiến phi tuôn rơi chan chứa lệ muôn hàng. Vũ trụ ngừng quay trong ngọn lửa kinh hoàng. Trời ơi, da thịt nào không nứt nẻ, máu xương nào không cháy rủi thành than. Khói xám tung bay mà cả một khung trời, mắt nhìn nhau qua nghi màn lệ rưng rưng. Khi chiếc áo nhà tu đã dần dần tan trong lửa đỏ.
All right, so it's performed by Hanga, who was very famous in the 60s, 70s, and who died in the 80s. Thank God for this information. I don't listen to much of that kind of music, but I found this extremely moving, both in the voice itself, and well, she was also extremely beautiful, but the way she performs it, right? So I imagine that was the case for Cham narrative. So they were like conveying a message, conveying a strong moment in history, but also they also meant to appeal to people's emotion, regardless of their background. Here that it's aimed at all the Vietnamese, right? Even if they're not Buddhist, and regardless of their own personal history. Yeah, and with that I will conclude, and thank you very much for your attention. Sorry, I just need to drink. Never mind. Later.
Okay, thank you so much, Nicolas, for that very haunting sharing, and it just gives, I think, the faculty and the students here an idea of the kind of work that has to go into this. You know, learning so many different languages and spending the 2 decades and just looking at so many different sources, not just written sources, but sound sources, through and talking to many people as well, through many regions, in order to put together this multifaceted and this research that examines a lot of different perspectives, right? And that's very much and also questioning not just official narratives, but also even your own teacher, your own mentor, right? Which is always a hard thing to do because, because this is someone from a minority group, and this is a narrative that is complex, and you're introducing that complexity and being comfortable with that complexity, but also working slowly to try to see parallels and resolutions. That's really, I think your work exemplifies a lot of what we hope that our research here at Fulbright will do, and also what our students will learn also at Fulbright, to have this critical thinking. So I think this is really wonderful and exemplary. I want to pick up. I want to pick up just to start on something that you mentioned, which is that it's not so simple, right? Many Cham elites collaborated with the Vietnamese authorities in the sort of disassembly of the nation at many points in history. Now, the students of VS 205, Theory and Methods in Vietnam Studies, have recently also read 2 of your papers on the Cham areas, and where in the areas they also talk about the role of these elites in this collaboration. So, but I think in the presentation you perhaps didn't get to explore it in much detail, and I wonder if you could explain the ways, specifically in which this collaboration happened. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Thank you for your comments and your question. Well, Cham. Well, we have to look at the Cham in not as a homogeneous group, right? It's a multiple groups, as in, of course, many other communities around the world. So we shouldn't say the Cham against the rest of the world. The Chams were deeply divided in very many different factions or political families, and that is true for Vietnam, because Vietnamese became involved in Cham politics from the 16th century, 17th century, until the end of Champa in the 19th century. So the elite was divided according to various political agendas, right? What happened in the case of Cambodia was exactly the same. Cambodia was also deeply divided from the 16th century, 17th century. The country was, I would say a political mess, right? The royal court was like totally was torn between political factions, right? There was a faction that was pro-Vietnamese, there was a faction that was pro-Thai, and they were fighting with each other. And so the Cham, well, in order to survive, they had to choose leaders, right? To make sure that they could survive. What happens in the Cambodia case is like it was possible through the system of patron-client structure. The Cham chose a patron. Sometimes he was a Cham leader, but most of the time he was a Khmer leader, either someone from the royal family, which is very common, or somebody powerful like a minister or something. And they would be, and of course these people were fighting together, so they would be fighting with another. So that's how the political involvement happened. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
Okay, I want to invite questions from the audience as well. Yeah, Sean, I think. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicolas. That was fabulous. And it's I know a little bit about the kind of work that you do, but it's wonderful to hear you elaborate in so much detail. I was curious about the written sources that you use, and you showed us some samples on the screen. And I was wondering if those were contemporaneous, so written more or less as the events that they described took place, or would they have been written sort of quite a lot later after the fact, but by people who were eyewitnesses, or are they recollections several generations later? How closely related are they to the events that they describe? And do you find these at archives or private collections? Where do you actually encounter these texts?
Thank you for your question, Sean. Yes, the Cham documents that I have used are copies of manuscripts that were found in Cambodia during the colonial period. From what I've seen, I think that mostly they were written by people who had lived the events, but probably not immediately as the event was happening. I think it was written from memory. Right? That's the case for Cambodia, and that's the case for Vietnam narratives as well. It's quite clear that it's from memory. Right? But I don't know if I mentioned that, but no, I think I haven't. Most of the narrative are anonymous, right? And there's a purpose for that. And they are made of not only one experience, but several experiences, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why the names are taken out, right? Because it's a collective experience, even though sometimes it's written at the first person. Yeah, no, thank you.
And just to chime in a little bit there, Professor Weber has also run a 300-level course in the fall on sources of Southeast Asian history, where I think he covered some of these, like how you would gather sources for very diverse types of sources to write and to understand this history. and also that the Vietnam Studies program will soon, and I think in the fall semester, be maybe running into some money and being able to launch a big oral history project, which will fund undergraduate students to go out into the communities and to, in a way, capture, memories, people's memories, because this was oral memory, right? Eventually, in song, right, preserved through verse, preserved through song, later on written down. So I think that's something that's a tradition we will also continue here at Fulbright. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. So in my class, I read your article about the assimilation and destruction of Champa, and I found it very interesting, especially that there's the first time that I read a Champa poem, even though that in English, because I was born in Ninh Thuận province, and I have a lot of Cham friends, but that is the first time I read the poem. So my question is, you mentioned, the role of land toward Champa culture in your article, and in diaspora, Champa diaspora, which means that they fled to another country and stay away from the homeland. So I just wonder that some ethnic people with culture that attacked themselves with physical things like land, for example, how their culture can reserve or continue, especially when they are a diaspora community. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. I don't have the full answer for that. I'm still working on it. But like you said, there is a very strong. There is a taboo in traditional Cham society. You shouldn't live outside of your borders, your village border of your. So you're not supposed to live in someone else's place, let alone country. So how did they deal with it? I didn't find anything, any evidence that how they deal with it. They dealt with it. I think that was quite a trauma. But from what I've seen in Cambodia, they actually root their history. They make only very few mentions of Champa. Actually, it doesn't exist anymore. It exists through the language. It exists through the traditions, but it's not theirs anymore. But they root their history in Cambodia, so that they replace their roots. They're replaced with Cambodian roots. So that would be, I think, the way they chose to deal with the history. So they, of course, they perpetuate the memory of exile, but they don't emphasize on the loss of the country. They do describe the process of moving and the effect that it had on their communities, but they also at the same time emphasize that, well, now Cambodia is the pays, sorry, that was French, the country they live in, and they are legitimate and they are Cambodians, right? So that's how they deal with I guess that taboo and that pain, that trauma of displacement and exile. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for this talk. I'm really happy I came. I'm surprised at how kind of familiar it feels, because obviously your work is very interdisciplinary, sort of what you're doing with the different genre, trying to identify this genre, continuous maybe genre of literary form, poetic form, and narrative is really interesting. It obviously is musicalized in different vernacular ways, right? And I also think the Odyssey title is excellent because, of course, Homer is an oral poet as well, and a way of transmitting over time a lot of historical information, or legendary information, shall we say. But my question, I noticed that several of the performers, or maybe all the performers that you chose, are female performers. And I was just curious about, I mean, this is like the Homeric question, is do we know the gender? Is it obvious from the composition? Because I don't know Cham language. Are there gendered pronouns? Do we know what the perspective of the sort of speakers? You said this sort of universalizing perspective in a sense, but are we sure? But you did say the poet he. And so I'm just wondering now, you know, what do you think about the kind of poetic tradition and the potential authors? Because if the performance is available to women, then how do we know that the composition was also not female directed, right?
That's true. Thank you very much. That's a very good question and observation. I think the participation of women is quite recent. Most probably, if we look at, again, there's no way to know how it happened in the past. Maybe there were some females, but when we look at, for instance, the way narratives are performed in Vietnam, it's mainly male. Sung poetry in Java as well was mainly male at the beginning. Is the same for Shire. There were maybe a few women that were performing, but they would perform not for the whole community, but they would only perform for women from a family, because of the separation of genders and all. So traditionally, it's a male thing. It's performance, at least. Regarding the writing, there's no way to know if it's a female or a male, because there's no gender in Cham, right? It's he or she. It's the same, right? Unless he puts he, not he. Unless it specifies later that it's a female or a male, then there's no way to know. Yeah, but for the performance, mainly it was male. Now it's becoming female because I guess it's more attractive, and people are. In the case of Tembang Sunda, for instance, Javanese, West Javanese sung poetry, people were actually more moved by female voices than male voices, so that's why it shifted. Yeah, and for the Cham, I guess it's something similar. It's more attractive. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so while you guys are thinking of your next question, I have a few more. So recently, I mean, the two things. First of all, on what I found is on Facebook, I think like about 2 weeks ago or 1 week ago, my sense of time is terribly warped because of huge amount of work recently. But there was this viral post by a Cham man who was saying that every year he came to one of the Cham temples. I think this one was in Nha Trang, right? And he was just explaining to people passing by about his culture and his heritage. And then there was this park ranger or like official who came, who was not Cham, who was king, right? Who came and told him he can't do that. He has to be a licensed, state licensed. Like tour guide in order to give tours, and he was very angry because he said, first of all, a lot what the state licensed tour guide said, he doesn't really agree with, but more importantly, right, like this was his heritage, and he should have the right to benefit. I mean, not just to tell his story, but also just like, even I don't know if he was even taking any money, but he also felt that in a way that, all of the financial benefits of tourism for these Cham historical sites have more or less gone to king people, either through jobs or through the state, right? And this raised a bit of online discussion, but it it wasn't covered by any state media, or as far as I know, like it was just a Facebook discussion. I guess maybe it was like something no one even like dared to touch, at this point. And then I also have visited, as a tourist, some of these places where it's weird, right? Because I've seen some of the Cham dances are performed by King people for like international tourists. But I also have seen some places where the communities have, I mean, not just Cham communities, but also like Hmong communities and other places, right, have sort of cashed in on the tourism, right? Like, okay, yeah, wear our costumes, like culturally appropriate, whatever, our culture, but like, you know, as long as the cash comes to us, it's sort of okay. Anyway, it's a sort of a broad question on tourism and heritage and who gets to benefit from it. I don't know if you have been following any of these stories or have your views on it. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I haven't looked at this post. I saw the title and then, well, I wasn't very interested to go into that. But yeah, the issue is that, and Cham in Vietnam have been, I mean, the ones I know have been complaining about it a little bit and they are a bit resentful about what's going on. It's like they feel that their culture is not in their hands. They are not the ones who decide. Like, for instance, the organization of festivals is the Vietnamese government who decides what festival can be performed and when. Now, even the dates, you know, even the dates, sometimes they don't correspond to the Cham traditional calendar. So they're very resentful of that, and they say, well, their culture and their sites are not in their control. So it's the kin, the majority, who decides for them. Yeah, that's an issue, and that's probably why it's not in a national newspaper, because I think it's quite sensitive. And from what I gathered from the people I've talked to, is like, it's not that they're against the government, but they wish they were consulted, right, when it comes to culture or traditions or religion. At least they would like to have a say and say, okay, this is not okay to do that, this is okay to do that, and so on. So yes, that's an issue that that has been going for quite a while, because I've came across another narrative from Vietnam, this one, Cham narrative, 19th century Cham narrative. And it describes the travel of a French from central Vietnam to the north, because he was looking for inscriptions, Cham inscriptions, and he was doing some census of Cham temples. That's a very famous scholar whose name is Emonier. So this narrative was written by one of his collaborators. So they describe the place they've been to and their feelings, being aware from their homelands and what they see on the way. And they visit all the old temples, the one in Nha Trang, the one in Misen and all. And it's very interesting, because they say, well, these are supposed to be us, but actually they are not us. They are not ours anymore, because when you enter in, you can only see Vietnamese people worshipping this god, and it's not even for us anymore. So yeah, that's something that has been going on for a while, and unless there is a real discussion between the groups, then I don't know how it can be solved. And unfortunately, yes, when it comes to tourism and the promotion of culture, yeah, of course, it benefits only a certain people and not the people who are from this culture. Well, that's not only in Vietnam, right, but it's quite universal as well.
Yeah, just one more question. Your talk really dealt with more like 19th century onwards, but your title of your book is 10 centuries. So I wonder if you could say something about the other centuries, the other periods that you work on, and sort of where your research, I don't know, I don't know what kind of, you have themes, but I'm just wondering, where do the other periods come in?
Thank you. That's a legitimate question. Yeah. The first goal of this study was like to feature like a chronology of the history of this diaspora and take it as the center, right? and seeing not only as accidental but as a main factor of Southeast Asian development. So for the earlier periods, I go back to the 10th century, right? But I have very few documents. And obviously, I'm mainly basing these chapters on like his official sources, Vietnamese official sources, which were compiled and rewritten for centuries. Yeah. So the bulk of my research, I would say, is 19th century. Late 18th century, 19th century. Why I'm not focusing on that period, well, I guess to be a bit more attractive. I was afraid that if I put like the history of 19th century diaspora, is probably not going to be very attractive to scholars, right? So that's why I tried to put it in a more broader perspective. But in terms of documentation, the most all my main documents come from late 18th century, 19th century, 20th century. That's I got huge documentation regarding this. So that's why.
I mean, except of course the Vietnamese documents also show, I guess, in part your range as well, right? Because you also had to learn, classical Chinese to read these many much older Vietnamese documents, and I think they are quite relevant. Yeah. Are there further questions? Well, if not, I also have that, as you say about, when we talk about heritage, right, and how we share heritage and what models to think about, what you say, and especially also reflecting on my visits to My Sơn, where there's the original statue, Cham statue, I think, somewhere in the temple. I wonder if it's original, and then it's covered by the Vietnamese, right, in sort of Vietnamese costumes, and becomes a different god for the Vietnamese, a very similar god to the Chams, but a different god for the Vietnamese. I wonder, because one of the models that comes to my mind instantly is actually Istanbul, the Hagia Sophia. So for context, this was a church that the Christians built, that the Byzantine Empire built. I don't know when, like maybe 11th century, maybe earlier actually, probably like 9th century. Yeah, and it's huge. It's one of the wonders of the world for sure. And when the Ottoman Turks took over 1453, they covered, because in Islam you can't have images, right, inside a mosque, because that would be considered idolatry. That would be very bad. So they covered up all the beautiful mosaics from the Byzantine period, unwittingly also preserving those beautiful mosaics, right? Because much of the exposed mosaics in other places have been lost, right? And now, very recently, the Turkish government has actually decided to uncover parts of Hagia Sophia, which is now a mosque, right? Right, and then they rededicated it as both a mosque and a church, right? Or is it now just fully a church? It's just...
It was neutral for a while. Sorry. In that case, from what I understand, when I understood, maybe I'm wrong, but it was for a while like a-religious. It was not Christian, not Muslim. It was just a-religious. But recently they turned it back into a mosque. Yeah, so I don't know what has happened to the mosaics you mentioned. Yeah,
Yeah, so maybe that's a better. But I think that there was at one point where I think the previous government, where they opened up the mosaics again and they allowed Christians and Muslims to both worship there, which the recent government maybe Erdogan has maybe changed it more differently. But I wonder if that's potentially a model to think about in relation to My Sơn or other such sites. There's a lot of so one final thought is that the the Cham people in Vietnam today are still seen by many Vietnamese. Like it's sort of an exoticization, right? After the conquest, I guess. But many Vietnamese people seek out Cham mediums and Cham like holy people or spiritual guidance from Cham people to pray for all sorts of things, right? And there are many sort of Cham community leaders, I suppose, who sort of lean into this. And I wonder if you've if you've talked to these communities, if you have any interest in looking at this, at how a lot of even quite young Vietnamese people, mainly women, right, sort of look at Cham people as being like more spiritually connected, and therefore like could be guides for them to perform these quite expensive prayers and cashing in on that reputation, I guess. Is it a way of doing reparations, indirectly?
I don't think so. But that reminds me of that's not something that is unique to Vietnam, and I'm not sure if it's really in the quest of spirituality. It's more like magic, right? Things that are connected to magic. But well, in the Cham case, magic and religion are undissociable, right? You cannot separate one from the other. But that reminds me of other countries like Malaysia, for instance. Well, yeah, it's most of the time women that go and seek these kind of services. But the Muslim women would go to, for instance, they would go to the north of Malaysia at the border with Thailand, right? And they would seek some Thai Buddhist, not magician, but monk who would be versed in like amulets and all too. Because to them, because it's foreign, it's in a foreign language, like what you said, very exotic, so it's supposed to be more powerful. As long as they don't understand what he says, it's even more powerful, right? So I think that's the same thing that happens in Vietnam, right? Something that you don't understand is obviously more powerful than something you understand, definitely. So I think it's more related to that, but I could be wrong. Yeah.
Well, so I think we have about 5 minutes left. We don't have to go until time. I just want to make sure that anyone who has any questions or reflections have your chance. Okay, going once, going twice. Okay, if not, then yeah, then we can say a big thank you to Dr. Nicolas Weber for today, for sharing with us his really wonderful research, or a very small slice really of his wonderful research. There is a lot more, and we're lucky because he's gonna be here for a long time. I remember when we were doing the hiring last year, I was tapping on some friends because I know we really wanted to get in also someone who had, because we were very King focused in all our research and teaching so far. So I tapped some friends like Billy Noseworthy at Cornell, and Emiko and these guys, and just asking around like who in the field might be available, might be willing to move to Vietnam, and and we want definitely to bring this research here, and we're very lucky to have you. I was really happy when you applied, and I hope that in the future, in a way, reflecting as major coordinator is a little bit. It's a bit sad that we don't have graduate studies yet in these fields here at Fulbright. I think eventually we should build it so that, because you're such a great resource, I think, for people who want to do deep research, for the undergrads, we have to find ways to help you build the skills, the language skills, and the research skills necessary in order to make full use of someone like Nicolas here. And I hope that in the future our program will evolve, and will think of more ways, both in terms of teaching capacity, but also in terms of the library, in terms of what we can bring in, research funding, in order to really push this side of research, because I think it is a very integral part of Vietnam studies. Anyway, at the end of the day, very happy for this sharing. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for today, and thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming as well. I hope you enjoy your lunch. There's some more baguettes. Please grab it. Thanks so much.